Hello there folks, and welcome to a special video. We are going to be departing from our Let's Plays for a moment to talk about a question I get asked regularly. What kind of computer do I need to run Space Engineers? And more specifically, what kind of computer do I need to run Space Engineers planets? Today, I am here to answer that question. Not only that, we are going to be doing this as cheaply and affordable as possible. In fact, it's going to be, around $275 to $350, depending on what kind of specs you want to go out with. All right. In this video, I will list the minimum requirements, as recommended by me, to give you a great gaming experience. I'll also give you prices and 2 different build options for those interested. And finally, in addition, I'm going to be recommending a couple of places to get hardware that most people may not think of. So, alright, let's get started. As you see here, we have a used Dell Optiplex 790. It's usually cheaper to get used parts, and as long as you get your parts from a reputable dealer, you won't have any issues at all. And I would recommend against getting the slim design as I did, as you will need a full width case for this build. You can still build it with a slim case, it just takes a lot more work, as you'll soon see. Anyhow, I managed to get this off the Dell Auctions website for $80 plus $15 shipping, bringing the grand total to somewhere in the neighborhood of $100, which is why I went with the slim design because it's a bit cheaper. You can get the full width cases for about $50 more in general, and it's a much better option for those of you who aren't as technically inclined or don't want to rip apart a perfectly good computer. The heart of this particular computer is an Intel i3 running at 3.1 GHz. It's not a powerhouse by any means, but it'll do just nicely for Space Engineers and any other game you might want to play. If you decide an i3 isn't your thing, you can get an i5 machine for around $220. In addition, all computers from this site come preloaded with Windows, which is a $100 value right there, so that's another reason to go with this site. The other components that came with our i3 include a 250GB, 7200 RPM hard drive, 4GB of DDR3 system memory, a Dell motherboard, a god-awful HD 6350 graphics card, if you can call it a graphics card, a 250-watt power supply, a DVD-RW, a brand new keyboard and mouse, a 30-day warranty, and a proprietary to VGA video cable adapter for the stock video card. It's a great value and you get a lot for your money. However, we're not just done with the parts yet. We need a couple of more things. If you have a small, non-slim form factor case, all you need is 4GB, 2x2GB sticks of DDR3 and a 750 Ti. I would recommend the Zotac GTX 750 Ti as it does not require an external power connector and is powered purely through the PCI port. The included power supply will not support anything that requires more power than the aforementioned 750 Ti. And in addition, the 750 Ti has 2GB of VRAM, which is more than adequate for 1080p gaming on this system. Also, it has support for DVI, DisplayPort, and HDMI, which makes it great for any display that you might have. For the computer build itself, if you're feeling a bit more adventurous, you can also get a new 300 or more watt power supply. It's not needed, but it's good if you ever want to upgrade anything on this system. If you do decide to get the slim case version for any reason, like I did, you will also need to purchase a new power supply and a case that supports a micro ATX motherboard or larger. And if you do get a more powerful power supply, you should be able to get a GTX 950 or an R7 370 for around $30 to $60 more. Any card more powerful than that and you will be wasting your money, as this CPU really is not designed for high-end gaming. One thing to note, if your computer comes with a 32-bit version of Windows, like they sometimes do, you will want to reinstall the OS as a 64-bit version of Windows with the provided Windows CD key, so you can take advantage of more than just 4GB of system memory. As you can see, there is a proprietary front USB and power switch header. Unfortunately, we won't be able to use these. What I ended up doing for my power switch was removing the wire and button entirely from the Dell case and installing it in the new case. It's a bit of a hassle, but it can be done. Also, there were 2 temperature sensors that can be reinstalled. I decided not to, as they aren't critical to the system. However, one annoying feature of not having them installed is that when booting, the motherboard will spit out an error saying that they aren't connected. It's nothing major, you just need to press F1 to continue. But if that would annoy you too much, just reinstall them and set the sensors off to the side. Alright. Before we get on to the benchmarks, let's take a look at the two separate build options for this gaming rig. So we have the slim case design and we have the regular width design. And the slim case design is based around the Optiplex 790. And that'll cost you around $100 to $130 on the Dell Auctions website. Because it is an auctions website, sometimes they go for more, sometimes they go for less. I waited a long time and I managed to get mine for $95 after shipping. But if you want to get yours right now, you're probably going to end up paying a little closer to $130. Also, you're going to need 4 gigabytes of DDR3, two 2GB sticks in a dual channel setup. You're also going to want a 300 watt power supply. That'll cost you around $22. Anything more powerful than a 300 watt and you're kind of wasting your money, as an i3 doesn't overclock and you don't really need extra wattage for overclocking because you don't need the extra headroom. And the computer case, $25 to $30, so I estimated around $27. And then you need the Zotac GTX 750 Ti, which will cost you around $105, bringing the grand total to $279 to $309, which is not bad at all. And if you want to go with the regular width case, which does not require as much elbow grease, all you need is the Optiplex 3020. They do sell for a little bit more, $150 to $180, but you don't need a lot of the other stuff and you don't have to build much. All you have to do is pop in the RAM and the graphics card. So the other thing you need is the 4 gigabytes of DDR3 for $25 and the 750 Ti for $105, bringing the grand total to $280 to $310, and that's as of the time I'm making this video. The prices will obviously change if you're watching this further down the road, and that's only $1 more than the slim case, but you do get a 300 watt power supply with the slim case design. Also, as you can see, the actual money that I spent, I got my Optiplex 790 for $95. I had an old case lying around, so if you have an old case lying around, you can use that too. And that cost me absolutely nothing. I had an old power supply lying around, which cost me nothing. So if you have an old power supply lying around as well, you can use that. But the GTX 750 Ti did cost me $105, and the 4 gigabytes of DDR3 did cost me $25, bringing my grand total to $225. So it can be even cheaper than this if you have some parts lying around. Alright, before we get started, I would like to mention a couple of things about the benchmarks. You are going to be seeing some artifacting in some of the videos. And at first I was going to remove the artifacting and re-record all of the video. However, I decided to keep it in there for a very specific reason. That reason being that artifacting is a visual manifestation of bottlenecks in the system, and more specifically of CPU bottlenecks. And the reason for that is that the recording equipment that I uses on-the-fly video encoding that uses your CPU. And more specifically, single-threaded CPU performance, at least the way that I have it set up. So when you have artifacting occurring, that is due to the fact that there's not enough processing power in some aspect, which means that if you were to want to actually record video in addition to play your games, this is probably not the computer to do it on. However, actually, some of the games that we are going to be benchmarking is absolutely perfectly fine. However, Space Engineers, not so much. It's not a very optimized game, and it does require a lot of single-threaded CPU performance. So, with that out of the way, let's get on to our benchmarks. As you can see, the frame rate playing on high settings on planets is, well, it's acceptable. We got an average frame rate of 28 frames per second, a maximum of 37, which is more than adequate. However, we had a minimum frame rate of 12 frames per second, and that is going to be very noticeable. And as you can see, there were a number of places where it dipped down into the low teens. And that is in large part due to loading things off of the hard drive into VRAM, because the VRAM isn't quite enough to hold everything that you need. And if we would drop down the settings on the textures to, say, medium settings, which we're going to be taking a look at, you'll notice that the frame skips are a lot less, and they do not nearly impact the performance the way they do on high settings. Let's take a look at the CPU usage. The average CPU usage was 28% with a maximum of 43 and a minimum of 7. And the reason I kept the artifacting in place was because just by looking at the CPU usage, you would never think that you were CPU bound, but you really are due to the single-threaded performance. And there's going to be something interesting showing up in the next CPU graph. We're going to be taking a look at that. But first, medium settings. Alright, that was much more playable with an average frame rate of 31 frames per second, a maximum of still only 37 frames per second, so something is capping us. Probably our CPU, maybe our GPU, but I'm pretty sure it is our CPU, and a minimum frame rate of 23 frames per second. So even when we get those frame skips, they are less frequent, they are shorter in duration, and they don't jump down nearly as far as they did on the high preset. So let's take a look at the CPU usage. Interestingly, the average CPU usage was 29% with a maximum CPU usage of 55%, which was actually more than on high settings, which is very strange. And we had a minimum CPU usage of 18. All right, let's take a look at Space Engineers in space at high settings. As you can see, this system handles space very well. Even on high settings, we got an average of 57 frames per second, which is incredibly playable. Our maximum frame rate never exceeded 60 frames per second. However, our minimum never dropped below 44 frames per second. So those frame skips in space, you're not going to notice them because they really don't drop below what the human eye can see, which is somewhere in between, 30 and 60 frames per second. So 44 frames per second, more than adequate. And I think your viewing experience will be very satisfactory. And the CPU usage was an average of 27%, a maximum of 43, and a minimum of 18. Nothing really interesting to see here. It doesn't peak too high, it doesn't really drop too low, and we still probably are bound by our single-threaded performance, but it does the job just fine. Let's take a look at the medium settings now. As you can see by this graph, we had a very buttery smooth average of 60 frames per second. However, we never really exceeded 60 frames per second at our maximum either. However, our minimum never dropped below 59 frames per second, so that means that this is a very consistently 60 frames per second preset if you want to select it. And you're going to have a very pleasurable viewing experience when on medium settings in space. And CPU usage, nothing really to see here. We had an average of 25%, a maximum CPU usage of 38%, and a minimum CPU usage of 20%. Alright, let's be honest. You're going to play more than just Space Engineers on this computer. And this being a value-oriented computer, perhaps you're going to want to play a value-oriented game or something you don't have to pay a lot of money for to get a lot of gameplay out of. So, the first game that we're going to take a look at, other than Space Engineers, is League of Legends on the maximum setting. And as you saw by that, the frame rate was incredibly smooth, and as you can see by this graph, we had an average frame rate of 167 frames per second. That's really good. And a maximum of 275 frames per second, and it only ever dropped down to 119 frames per second when shit hit the fan. So, as you see, the first portion of the graph has a lot higher frame rate, and that's because not a lot was going on screen, not a lot of explosions, not a lot of minions. However, there was a lot of stuff going on screen in the second half of the benchmark, and it never dropped below the 119 FPS mark, and it hovered right around the 120 to 130 FPS mark, which is incredibly playable, even when all sorts of things are going wrong on screen. And taking a look at the CPU usage, interestingly, the CPU usage is actually higher than it was on Space Engineers, and that's because this game does not require as much single-threaded performance. And the average was 41%, a maximum of 54%, and a minimum of 34%. And I'm sure if the single-threaded performance was even more and the GPU was a little bit better, we'd probably actually have higher usage, but we'd also get even higher frame rates. But I think that's enough. 164 frames per second on average it's enough for most people. All right, let's take a look at another game that you might play. Counter-Strike Global Offensive on maximum settings. All right, on maximum settings, we had an average of 129 frames per second, which is really, really good, and a maximum of 208 frames per second. However, the minimum, which I think this is just kind of like a bug, was 22 frames per second. As you see, that is in the very, very beginning of the graph, and I think that's just when I hit the record button. Sometimes there's a little lag skip there, so that's probably more due to the recording equipment. But if you look on the graph, other than that one spot, and I'm looking at the table right now, I think the lowest I can see is like 93 frames per second, so that would be your actual minimum, would be 93 frames per second, which is incredibly playable. And Counter-Strike Global Offensive does not require much single-threaded performance at all, and as you can see, the average CPU usage was 72%, and it wasn't GPU bound either, so we were able to get an incredible amount of frames, and a maximum CPU usage of 99%. However, the minimum CPU usage did at times drop down to the 15% area. And, well, maybe you want to play more than just value-oriented games, so how would this computer handle the newest AAA title that you can find that honestly looks really good? So let's take a look at Rise of the Tomb Raider on the high settings, and in fact, here are the settings to take a look at. Alright, so there you go. Very good looking game, and it actually runs fairly decently on this computer. We had an average frame rate of 27, which is about what you would get with a console. However, you do get better textures, better resolution, just better overall gameplay with a computer. But anyhow, you had a maximum frame rate of 37, which is really quite good, and it only ever dropped down to 22 frames per second, which is actually quite playable for such a good looking game. And if you did drop the settings down to medium settings, you'd probably get a much better frame rate even still. Let's take a look at the CPU usage. We had an average CPU usage of 43%, a maximum of 86, and a minimum of 21. And as you can see, there are quite a few spikes here, and certain things in the game require a lot of CPU usage. And those are what caused the spikes. And if we were in a more intense part of the game, we might see higher spikes than it might actually peak out the system, but it did not in this particular benchmark. Alright, well there you have it. That is my take on a $300-ish Space Engineers computer PC build. So tell me what you guys think in the comment section below. If you guys like this sort of content, you can head over to my other channel, link in the description below, and you can subscribe to that if you're into the tech sort of thing. And if you like this, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, do that other thing. So thank you folks for watching. If you have any other cool ideas for tech stuff or games in general, let me know. So thank you folks for watching, and I will catch you folks next time.